Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. I think today's topic is something we've all thought about at one point or another, liberal arts education.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But I think
Oh,
before we get into the dusty old textbooks and all that,
yeah, yeah.
we're going to kind of go a little deeper with this one.
That's right. And we've got a really interesting source for this deep dive. It's a personal essay, and it uses a single classroom experience to kind of open up this idea of what a liberal arts education really is
Yeah.
and how it can be relevant, for everybody.
Yeah. And I love how this essay starts out. It's with this story about two historians, and they were both studying the same historical period, right? The transition
That's
between
right.
the Middle Ages and the Renaissance.
Mm-hmm.
And you would think, well, they're looking at the same stuff. They're going to come to the same conclusions. But
Yep. But that's not what happened at all.
no, not even close.
It's really fascinating.
So tell me a little bit about these historians and what they thought.
Okay, so the first one is Jacob Burckhardt. Now, he saw the Renaissance as this amazing blossoming of culture, kind of bursting forth from the Middle Ages.
Like a flower coming out of the dirt.
Exactly. And he wrote this famous book. It's called The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. And in it, he really stresses this idea that the Renaissance was a totally new era, a distinct break from what came before it.
Hmm.
Now, the other historian is Johann Huizinga,
Hmm.
and he had a very different perspective.
Interesting.
His book is called The Waning of the Middle Ages.
Okay.
And his take is that the Renaissance was actually a reaction against the Middle Ages, like a pushing away. He saw the Middle Ages as a period of decline, of exhaustion. And to him, the Renaissance was almost like a response to that decline, almost like a grasping for something new.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
It's two totally different ways of seeing the same events.
Exactly. And that's the thing. Both of these historians, they had valid points. They were both looking at the same basic facts of history, but their interpretations, their perspectives were completely different.
So who was right?
Well, that's the really interesting part. Neither one was necessarily wrong. That's what this essay highlights so well. It shows us this core principle of the liberal arts, and it's this. It's not always about finding the single right answer. Sometimes there are multiple interpretations that can exist at the same time. And the way you look at something, the lens you're using, it can change your entire understanding of it.
That is so true. I'm even thinking about just everyday life. Like, let's say you and I are watching the same news story.
Right.
It's the same facts being presented, but we could have completely different reactions to it
Absolutely.
because our own individual experiences, our viewpoints, they all color how we see the world.
Yeah, that's the power of perspective. And that's something a liberal arts education can really open your eyes to.
Yeah.
And this brings us to another key point this essay makes. A liberal arts education, it's not about seeking out these simple, comfortable answers.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it can often be pretty frustrating. It's about challenging your assumptions, getting comfortable with complexity. Sometimes there are no easy answers.
Oh, tell me about it. I remember when I was in college, I just wanted the professor to tell me the answer.
Right.
Just give me the information. But looking back, I think that struggle, it helped me. It helped me develop those thinking skills.
Exactly. It's like you're building up a critical thinking muscle.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about having an opinion. It's
Yeah.
about being able to actually analyze different viewpoints, weigh the evidence, and then form your own conclusions based on what you've learned. It could be a little bit tough, but those skills, they're valuable no matter what you do.
Yeah, it's like instead of just accepting what you're told, you're learning how to think for yourself. But
Right.
doesn't that mean we're constantly second guessing ourselves?
That's a really good question. And it actually gets to the heart of why this critical thinking stuff is so valuable. See, it's not about just questioning everything forever. It's about developing a process for how you evaluate information and make judgments.
Mm-hmm.
And you can use that process for anything, really. I mean, whether you're reading a news article or trying to make a tough decision at work, even something as simple as figuring out which new phone you should buy.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? How can we use this critical thinking stuff in everyday life?
Well, I think a good starting point is being aware of your own biases.
Okay.
We all have them, right? And these biases, they can really influence how we understand information without us even realizing it. So once you kind of recognize your own biases, the next step is to seek out different perspectives. Don't just stick to the sources that tell you what you already believe.
Right.
Challenge yourself a little bit. Look at viewpoints that maybe make you a little uncomfortable, a little different from your own.
Yeah, I get that. But sometimes, the more information I get, the harder it is to make a decision.
Right.
It's almost like information overload or something.
Totally. And that's where that weighing the evidence part comes in.
Mm.
You got to look for reliable sources. Think about who's giving you this information and if they're credible. Don't be afraid to ask questions either. And I think the most important thing is to remember that critical thinking, it's not about finding the perfect answer. It's about using the information you have at that moment to make the best decision you can.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so this essay we're looking at today, it tackles another misconception about the liberal arts. It's this idea that they're all just, soft subjects,
Ah, yes.
like humanities or the arts. But the essay actually says that's not really true.
Yeah, it's a very common stereotype, but I think it misses the point. Even science, which we often think of as being objective, just facts, even science involves interpretation.
Oh.
The essay makes a good point. Science itself is a way of interpreting the world, and our understanding of science is constantly evolving.
So even in science, there isn't always just one, clear-cut answer, right?
Exactly. Think
Yeah.
about evolutionary theory, for example. I mean, there's tons of evidence to back it up,
Right.
but scientists are still refining their understanding of how evolution works all the time. They're constantly interpreting new data, proposing new hypotheses, and having debates about the details.
That's interesting because it makes you realize that even in these hard science fields, there's room for different perspectives, different interpretations.
Absolutely.
It's not just about memorizing a bunch of facts from a textbook.
Yeah.
It's about understanding how all of those facts fit into a bigger picture. And that bigger picture is always changing, always being updated.
I think another really good example is the nature of light. For centuries, physicists argued about whether light was a wave or a particle.
Yeah.
And turns out it's kind of both. Understanding that, how something can be two seemingly opposite things at the same time, that requires a real shift in thinking. It's not a simple answer, right? It's more complex than that.
That's a great point. And it shows that even in these super technical fields, being able to think critically, to be open to different interpretations, that's so important. You can't just rely on memorization or black and white thinking when you're dealing with these complex problems. It really highlights how a liberal arts education, it can help you develop those adaptable thinking skills that are going to be useful no matter what field you end up in.
Okay, so let's kind of shift gears for a minute and talk about why all this stuff actually matters, especially, in the world we live in today. This essay we've been discussing, it starts by talking about how divided our world feels right now.
Yeah.
And it suggests that, maybe a liberal arts education could be a way to help bridge those divides. That's a really powerful idea. The essay, it really focuses on this, understanding other people's viewpoints, even if you disagree with them, even if you really strongly disagree.
Right.
And in a world where it's so easy to just surround yourself with information that already agrees with what you think, to just stay in your own little bubble.
Yeah.
Being able to actually engage with different perspectives, that's more important than ever.
Yeah. It's like we're all living in our own echo chambers. We just hear what we want to hear.
Exactly.
But if we want to have any kind of productive conversation, especially about those big, important issues, we have to be able to step outside of those echo chambers.
And that's what a liberal arts education can help us do. It encourages you to be exposed to different viewpoints. And not just exposed to them, but to really try to understand them. Where are these viewpoints coming from? It's not about changing your own beliefs necessarily. It's more about building empathy. That ability to kind of see the world through someone else's eyes, even if you don't agree with them.
I can see how that would be so valuable today. Whether you're navigating those tricky political discussions or trying to make sense of all the social issues we're facing, or even just having a conversation with someone who just sees things differently than you do. Being able to really listen and understand, that can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. Think about how many arguments we could avoid, or at least make more productive. If we just took the time to really hear each other out, to try and understand where the other person was coming from.
It's not about agreeing with everything everybody says.
Right.
It's about creating that space for real dialogue, where people feel heard and understood, even if you don't always see eye to eye. So to bring all of this together, I think what we're saying is that liberal arts education, it's about so much more than just specific subjects or career preparation.
Yeah, it really is. It's more about developing a way of thinking, a mindset, one that's curious and that embraces critical thinking and empathy. It's about becoming a lifelong learner, someone who's adaptable, who's open to new ideas, and who can really engage with this complex world in a thoughtful and informed way.
And that's something that we can all benefit from, no matter what we do or where we come from. It's about equipping ourselves with those tools to navigate a world that's just getting more and more complex and interconnected all the time. So before we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to leave you with a question that this essay really made me think about. What lens are you using to look at the world? And how might that lens be shaping your own perceptions, your own interpretations of the things you encounter every single day?
Hmm. That's a really good question. I think once we become aware of our own biases, our own assumptions, we can start to see the world and each other in a much clearer, more understanding way.
And that wraps up our deep dive into the liberal arts education. I hope this conversation gave you some new insights and maybe even inspired you to think about the world in a new way. Thanks for joining us, if you are joining us.